How's everybody doing? Good. Can you hear me? I just hear myself screaming, but everybody else got me? All right, well, it's a little more. How's it get? I got a big head, so this thing's not long enough. How's that? Better? No?
We're going to turn it up. Give us a second.
All right. Turn it up, I'll talk loud. Well, look, I'm really happy to be back at the Big Soil Health event. I didn't make it last year. I really love this event, love coming to Cedar Falls. The reason I love coming to Cedar Falls so much is because I spend most of my time traveling everywhere else, and I make fun of Iowa constantly. So it's really nice I get to do it right here in front of them. But hey, most of you have heard me speak before, I think. Some of this is gonna be new, or some of it's gonna be repetitive, but I want to really kind of lead into what we've been working on the last 3 years, 4 years, and get into where we're trying to go. And when I was digging around in old presentations, I found this picture. And I used to throw this up a lot. So this is the original team from Regen Ag Lab. And I had to put it in because, my son is just angry about getting his photo taken. I'm the same way still to this day. But it kind of reminded me of where we started and kind of where we're at. As of right now, we have 26 employees. We started last year, we had 16, 17. So this is really growing rapidly, which is great for me, and that's fantastic. But what it tells me is that people are paying attention and that this matters to farmers, it matters to the ag retail industry, it's gaining traction. So keep up the good work. Now I show this all the time, and I do this because I want to show you a framework. I want you to start to think about, how many of you in here have ever run soil tests? Okay, most of you. So this is kind of that traditional layout of soil testing. You pull a soil sample, you send it off to the lab. They're gonna look at plant available nutrients. We can argue back and forth all day about what's really plant available, what's not. We're gonna measure soil pH, we're gonna look at organic matter. Then the job of the laboratory or the agronomist or your farmers to make fertilizer recommendations, right? Pretty straightforward. The problem though is that we're focusing all on plant fertility, soil fertility. We're not looking at biology. And this was something that we knew needed to change. So I'm going to step through a few soil tests just briefly. This is not a crash course on how the Haney test works. I know Liz and Russell put together a great workshop yesterday. Carolyn's here. She spoke a lot about the Haney test. So I'm not going to jump into that too much. But I want to lay out where we're going with this. Why are we doing this? I show this a lot because when I changed the way I thought of farms, it changed my approach to how we understand the test. And so when I talk about a supply chain diagram, I would think most of us, now I'm not a business major, so I have no idea really what I'm talking about. But I think when most of us think of a supply chain, we think of farmers are the supplier of raw material. And then you're done until you become a consumer of the products. But on the farm, we think of it more like this. The raw supply, the raw material are the nutrients. Who supplied them? God, Mother Nature, atmosphere. Where do they come from? The soil, the atmosphere, rock, all of those things. Who distributes these? The microorganisms. They are the ones that are distributing nutrients throughout your system, okay? It's not the guy who's driving the truck to bring it onto the farm. The retailer in this case is your crop. It's your plant. And then you are the consumer in this case. Now, when I started to think of it this way, I said, now, if we're going to evaluate efficiencies when it comes to nutrients, we need to evaluate different parts of this supply chain, right? So has anybody ever fallen guilty of taking what I like to call the moron approach? I've done that. The moron approach is this. When we run a soil sample and we look at your soil test, and we say, if the soil test number is low, put more on. And then, if you run a tissue sample, plant tissue sample, and your plant tissue says, well, I don't understand, I put more on the soil, but I don't have more in the plant. Put more on. That's always the answer, right? I didn't get the yield I liked, well, put more on. And in my part of the world, that includes water. We've got guys getting 26 to 28 inches of precip a year, and they're pumping another 30. Because they always take the moron approach. I'm not calling people morons, I'm just saying that's how it works. So we want to tear this down a little bit, and our first test I want to talk to you about is what's called total nutrient digest. Now, for all those people that raised their hand and said they've run a soil test before, has anybody ever given you this message? You only have 20 pounds of phosphorus. It says so right here on your test. And if you don't buy it all from me, you're going to be in trouble. Has anybody ever heard that? This is all you've got? The total nutrient digest test is going to show you what you really have. Okay? So in our supply chain diagram, think of this as an inventory of the raw material that your soil has. All the carbon, all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus, etc. And this is what one of those reports looks like. And I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see it a little bit. But this is a real example. It's not a manure sample. It's a soil, actually came from, I believe, Ohio. But when we zoom in on this soil in the top 6 inches has almost 61,000 pounds of carbon, 5,300 pounds of nitrogen, 2,300 pounds of phosphorus, just in the top 6 inches. Now, that middle column there, the one that isn't highlighted, I put up there what's called a fertilizer equivalency. This got me in some hot water. I like hot water, though. That's why I hang out with guys like Seth. So this is telling you that if you wanted to buy the equivalent of 5,300 pounds of nitrogen and you were buying urea, you would need 11,530 pounds per the acre. Now the fertilizer guy, first time when he saw this, he actually smiled really big and he's like, this is great. I'm going to tell people that they should buy 10,000 pounds of 11,520. And I said, no, you're missing the point. The point is putting on another 100 pounds going to get you anywhere when you already have 10,000? Maybe not. And you say, well, but it's not all available, right? You're right. It's not all available. This is just an inventory of everything you have. Now, this is really valuable. Can anybody throw some quick math numbers to this and say how much would it cost you to buy 11,000 pounds of urea? I don't know the current price of N, but do that math. There's real value in this, and this is what we're trying to access. So now, how do we evaluate what you actually have available to use, right? Doesn't do any good to have all those nutrients. We need to know what we have available. And in soil testing, we do this by extraction. So we extract nutrients out of the soil. And they've been doing this for a long time. So in 1945, Bray and Kurtz came out with their extraction called Bray P1. And then they followed that with Bray P2, so weak Bray, strong Bray. Maybe those are things you've heard of. And they used it to look at phosphorus. Okay, well, it works okay on low pH soils, sandier soils, low OM. It was developed at the University of Florida. Makes sense. Well, so then they said, well, okay, that doesn't work great on high calcareous soils. So Olson in 1954 came out with his extraction, and they looked at phosphorus, and that really used west of Nebraska. They argue about it all the time, and then in 1953, Malick came out with Malick 1, In 1978, he did Mehlich 2. It was a huge flop. Nobody used it. And then in 1984, he changed the face of soil testing forever by the development of what's called Mehlich 3. And the idea behind Mehlich 3 was to be a multi-nutrient extraction that you could do one extraction and then tell you all these different nutrients. Didn't work for nitrogen though, because Mehlich 3 is made up of ammonium nitrate. So in 1981, Whitehead published the method on extracting nitrate. Now, ironically, the reason why Mehlich wasn't too concerned about nitrate is because if you get east of the Mississippi River, a standard soil test is pH-PK. And they tell you that if you didn't use your nitrogen, it's gone. Your soils are either too heavy and it's too wet that you volatilize it all off, or you left it there and it had lighter soils and you leached it all. That's the message they give. Well, that was a really nice shortcut because they just couldn't figure out how to analyze nitrate using Mehlich. So that was the message, and now we find out that no, there's nitrogen there because guess what? Nitrate's being kicked out all the time to feed your grass and to feed the road ditches, and that's what the nitrogen cycle happens. So it's not all gone. And then here comes Rick Haney, who decided that he was going to go back out, work on a farm, and he works with a guy named CR in Oklahoma, wonderful man. And he says, you know what, I don't understand. He says, I run these soil tests every year. I get the same numbers on the soil test. They tell me to put the same thing on every year, the Moron approach. And he goes, I get the same result every year. Anytime the result was different, that was just based on rainfall. And he says, I don't understand. So Rick says, well, we got to go back and look at this. So he starts working on an extract called H3A. And he had a whole bunch of different versions of it, kind of like Mehlich. And he finally settled in 2017 on the final version that we use. The goal behind this was to say, well, we're not going to use chemistry. Look, I just showed you that with a TND test, I can use the strongest acids we have. I use hot plates to cook soil. We use peroxide to break down all the organic material. I can extract whatever you want me to extract out of your soil, except for gold. If I could figure out how to do that, we'd all be happy. But if you change the power of the extract, you change the result. And Rick says, well, we're using chemistry in the lab that doesn't exist outside of the lab. So he tried to develop an extract that would not overpower the soil. And that's all he's showing here. On the bottom, along the bottom, we've got soil pH, and along the top, we've got extractable phosphorus. I either ate too much or something, because I'm about to collapse this stage. I can feel it.
No, you're good.
I am good?
Yeah.
All right, I just stay over here.
I'm going to hope you're okay, but I think you're good.
Jeez, man. Skipped lunch today. All right, so on the left-hand side, we've got Mehlich 3. Mehlich 3 is a pH of about 2.5. Your stomach acid is a pH of 2. If you get Mehlich 3 on your skin, you want to wash it off fairly quickly. It's not great stuff. Matter of fact, it's not such good stuff that we have to sign a lot of paperwork when we're buying ammonium nitrate promising we're making Mehlich 3 instead of bombs. Don't get any ideas. But every time, it doesn't matter what the pH of the soil is, when you add Mehlich 3 to it, it overpowers the soil pH, it plummets the soil pH, and now you're over-extracting phosphorus, you're over-extracting calcium, things like that. So on the other side with Olsen, they say, well, we'll do Olsen. Well, it doesn't matter what the pH of the soil is, you drive the pH clear up to about 10, and now it doesn't work great for low pH soils because you've just completely overpowered what the soil is in your field. You've slammed a square peg into a round hole. On H3A, if you've got a soil with a pH in that 6 to 7.5 to 8 range, the extract has a pH of around 6.8 after you add it with the soil. If the pH of your soil is above 7.5, you've got high calcium soils, the pH jumps up to about 7.5 to 8. So it follows the pH of the soil. That's the idea. So we're going to use this extract to evaluate what's available in your system. And anytime you do this, you get a lot of people that kick and scream and yell and shout, and they say their favorite words. It's not calibrated. I love that. What the hell is calibrated? Who calibrated the first calibration to calibrate the next calibrations? Right? Well, okay, it's not calibrated. Well, it was correlated to these traditional extracts to understand what we're looking at. So my favorite argument back is I say, well, if the Haney test isn't calibrated, that's because it was calibrated from something that was never calibrated. Pretty simple. But this is showing the relationship and how well this extract works. Now, that does not mean that you're going to get the same value for potassium if you run ammonium acetate and you run Haney. But they're correlated, and that's important. So I've just got a couple of slides on this, and it's just the nutrient stuff. So I've shown this before. So Haney started off with this more holistic idea of how to measure soil. And if we just look at the nutrient side, this is the H3A, and the whole idea behind it was to use a soil extractant that mimics soil solution. Because your plants don't produce malic-3. It doesn't rain malic-3. Microbes don't produce malic-3. The system's driven off of organic acids in the soil with microbes. The plants drive that process. So we're going to make this extract, and then we're going to evaluate nitrate, ammonium, phosphate, potassium, all of the things that your normal soil test would show you, right? But we're also going to look at, now I got the word total down here. I need to change that word because total, this is total extractable, okay? The total nutrient digest is a true total. This is total extractable. Why we're measuring this is because plants like to take up phosphate, but phosphorus exists in the soil as a lot of different compounds, not just phosphate. And if they are soluble, if they can sit out in soil solution, what do microbes do? They eat them. When phosphorus is tied to carbon, they eat them. And we'll see in a next test why they do that. But in that process, they release phosphorus. So when those cells die and they fall apart and they're consumed by others, phosphorus is then released, and it's released a lot of times as phosphate. So it's mineralization of phosphorus. Just like when you see a tree growing out of a rock. You guys don't have rocks in Iowa because your soil's like 400 feet deep, right? But in the rest of the world, we have these things. So they're really hard. They're called rocks, and they come in different sizes. But you'll see a tree. If you ever leave this state and go west, you'll see a tree growing out of a mountain. Ray Archuleta shows that photo all the time. You say, well, how in the world did that happen? I always say, I want to know who the person is climbing up there with a bucket of fertilizer. Wouldn't that be a job? All the nutrients other than nitrogen and carbon are stored in that rock. The plants supply the carbon through photosynthesis. The microbes use that energy to break down the rock. Now, is breaking down rock going to keep up with the demand of a cornfield in central Iowa? No. But that process happens. We take advantage of that because it's all about dollars. Okay, so we talked briefly about how do we measure what's in the warehouse, the raw material, right? How do we look at everything in the raw material? Now we looked at how we know what's on the bottom shelf. This is the stuff that I can access, right? This is the easy stuff. Now let's talk about all of the dock workers, the warehouse loaders, the forklift operators, the truck drivers, etc. Because those are your microbes. They are the ones taking things out of the warehouse and transitioning it through a distribution system to the plant. Sometimes that is direct. As you know, Dr. White talks about rhizophagy. That is a direct transfer of nutrients. The microbes acquire the nutrients, they get taken in by the plant roots. The plants strip the nutrients off of the microbes and kick them back out to recharge. There can also be direct transfer through mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi form those associations with plant roots and transfer nutrients as conduit. And then there's also just indirect transfer by the processes that the microbes are doing. Now, I relate this, I'm an analogy person. If you haven't heard me speak before and you haven't figured it out yet, I learn everything through analogies. So I stand up here and talk about analogies all the time. In medicine, the analogy would be your gut, the human gut. The soil is the gut. We used to think that our small intestines just absorbed nutrients when we ate food. No. Your small intestine is where the microbes live. That's their home. The microbes transition nutrients across your small intestine. Now, the analog to that is that we used to think plant roots did what? Just sucked everything out of the soil? That's what I was taught. No, they provide the home. They're kicking out carbon into the soil system to feed these organisms. Now, a few years ago, I said this, I'll say it again. Did you know that 50% of all the sunlight energy your corn crop captures is leaked out into the soil through the roots while the corn's alive? The last time I said that, I had a guy raise his hand immediately and he says, how in the world do we stop that from happening? And I know why he asked that question, right? He's like, well, I can take a 250 bushel corn crop, that should be 500 bushels. It's losing 50% of its energy to the soil. We got to stop it. And I said, no, if you stop it, you get nothing. Now keep in mind, the plant has one goal. It's actually the same goal of all organisms. It is to acquire enough resources in the shortest amount of time possible so it can reproduce. In college, that was get a car. If you're a guy, right? Get a car, get a job, get your hair cut. I don't have that problem anymore. But that was the goal. And if your plant has the same goal for itself that you have for it, produce as much darn seed as I can possibly produce because I want to reproduce. So the plant's not doing this because it's nice, it's giving that up because it's feeding the organisms, and if it doesn't, it cannot get the nutrients it needs. It is a trading system, right? So here are the players. We got bacteria. Bacteria dominate our ag landscapes. They just do. Tillage to them is a roller coaster ride. They don't care. They like it. Actinomyces, completely the opposite. They are a bacteria, but they're a special group of bacteria. They grow like a fungi. They're filamentous, so they're like a net. This is where most of our antibiotics come from, is out of this group. These are the ones responsible for breaking down hard lignified material like corn stalks. And they smell really good when you kill them. Which is why people love, when they till the soil, they say, oh, it smells like fresh tilled earth, right? I love the smell of genocide in the morning. Like you're just killing all the darn actinomyces, and they release a compound called geosmin, and that's what you smell. Now, when I was in Minnesota last week, I made a comment. I said, somebody like Yankee should go make a candle just called fresh tilled earth, so then that way you can just put it in all your tractors, drive around. You smell that. And then somebody found one online and sent me the link to it. So it exists, apparently. So I guess I'll have to keep running soil tests because there went my $10 million idea. We've got fungi. Everybody thinks, oh, fungi, we got to kill all the fungi. Most of the fungi are beneficial. Saprophytic fungi break down material. Those are your decomposers. So if you ever have that piece of bread sitting on your counter that gets mold on it, saprophytic fungi, breaking that down. Mycorrhizal fungi get all the glory. But that's the other group. Now, mycorrhizal fungi are what they call obligate symbionts. So this is like that fungi cannot live without that host plant. If a spore from a mycorrhizal fungi goes to germinate, it's got 24 hours to find a living host plant where it's done. That is the simple reason why I now say fallow periods are the most detrimental thing you can do to soil health. Because those periods of rest or between crops, the mycorrhizal fungi have to start over every year. And they are responsible for most of our nutrient transport. Algae, protozoans, and nematodes, the unsung heroes of the microbe world. If you haven't stopped by in-soil algae yet, I would encourage you to do so. Algae is a big player. Photosynthetic, they're pumping carbon into the system. They often get overlooked in the microbe world, but they're a big player. Protozoans. Protozoans swim around the soil, they eat bacteria, and what happens when you eat? Yeah, thanks, Marty. I knew somebody would say it. My favorite four-letter word. My son would have yelled it out. Poop. They poop. Protozoans can graze up to 10,000 bacteria cells a day. Now, does anybody know what the C/N ratio of a mature corn crop is? 80-1. You know what the C/N ratio of a bacteria cell is? About 8. Some are 5-1. Some are down to 3-1. So if we just say 5-1. So when you put nitrogen fertilizer on your soil, are you fertilizing your corn? No. You're fertilizing the microbes because they take it, tie it up. How do we get it back? Protozoans eat bacteria. They have a C/N ratio of 15-1. So for every 3 bacteria they eat, they consume 3 times more nitrogen than they need. And then what do they do with excess nitrogen? Poop. That's fertilizer. That's the fertilizer process. Very few nutrients ever go directly into the plant. Foliar feeding might be the exception. So how do we measure these things? How do we measure the distribution team? Well, there's 3 main techniques. You can stare through a microscope. You can use molecular techniques like we do at the lab. And you can use genomics. Genomics is the up and coming. We've got a couple companies here that offer these types of services. Biomakers is here, Rise Bio is here. This is a really up and coming technology. It's really powerful. It can be really powerful. But this is how we're going to try to evaluate them. I'm going to spend just a little bit. Now, I don't stare through a microscope all day. I've done it. It's terrible. It's interesting, but it's terrible. And when you're doing hundreds and hundreds of soil samples every day, you can't look through a microscope. Before real quick, I screwed up there a little bit because before I jump into PLFA, there's one other way that we're looking at microbes, and it's a very rudimentary way, but it's a very important way. And that is the soil respiration off the Haney test. So with this test, we can't see who the players are, we're just looking at how many are there. It's a biomass measurement, right? And the way this works is we take soil that's dried and ground, and we mimic the drying and re-wetting process that happens naturally in the soil. It's really scientific. We take 40 grams of soil, put it in a little plastic cup, put it in a mason jar, add some water, seal it shut, and let it sit for 24 hours at controlled temperature. Then we measure all the carbon dioxide that those microbes blew off of that soil. And the more CO2 that your soil generates, guess what? The more life that's in it. And so this is a great way to measure effects of treatments when you're looking at different products or you're trying out different things. It changes throughout the year. Yes, it's influenced by temperature and moisture, but this is a great way of looking at how many microbes you have. Now, if we want to know who's there, we got to kind of dive in a little more. So the PLFA test, phospholipid fatty acid. Did you notice the first word in that? Phospho? That is phosphate. So every organism is made up of at least one cell, and that cell has a membrane. And that membrane contains phosphorus. That's why when I say microbes and the organic phosphorus, they're cycling, it's because they need phosphorus just as bad as everything else. Now, what's nice about this is that since all organisms have a cell membrane, we can extract all those cell membranes, we can tear them apart, and yes, we are killing all the microbes. And then we measure how much fat is in the soil. This is one of those times where you want to stand up and go, I got a real fat farm. You want all this fat in the soil. Fat is a biological molecule. Soil does not produce fat. Rocks are not fat. So it represents living biomass. Now, fat is a great energy molecule. I still haven't figured out how to utilize any of it off of my body, but they say it's good for energy. When microbes die, other microbes eat those fats, and they release phosphorus if they don't need it. So this is what a bacterial membrane looks like. And if we strip away all this other junk, we get this. You get this lipid bilayer. So the little bluish colored tails, those are their fats, and then the little spheres at the top and bottom, those are the phosphate groups. It's what keeps the outside of the cell out and the inside of the cell in. Now, what's nice about this is that different organisms produce different kinds of fats. So when you can extract all the fat, and you can measure it, but you can actually look at what types of fats are there. And we say, well, if we find these fats, these are bacterial. If we find these, those are fungal. If we find these, they're for protozoans. So you can get a little bit of an idea of the community structure. This test limitation, though, is that I cannot tell you what the species are. It's impossible with this type of technique. So this does not work well for disease identification or tracking down very specific problems. This is a community analysis. Now the goal is higher biomass, but diversity is more important. So I will pick a little bit on Iowa. A lot of soils in Iowa have high biomass. 3,500, 4,000, 4,500. There's a lot of biomass there because you've got a pretty decent environment for microbes to live in naturally. You know, temperatures, moisture, you've got that. You got soils. The problem, though, is that the diversity is usually incredibly poor. Why would that be? Lots of corn, right? Maybe some soybeans. I saw a lot of anhydrous rigs on the way up here, right? And so you've got a lot of microbes because you produce relatively high yield corn crops, but the only microbes that can survive are the ones that can eat corn, and the ones that can tolerate tillage, and the ones that can tolerate anhydrous. Now, I'm not telling you not to do any of those things, but here is the ramification of having a lot of microbes but very little diversity. Imagine if every person who lived in Cedar Falls was a lawyer. Would we still call it Cedar Falls? I bet Seth's got some colorful names he could come up with. Look, how well would that community function? I asked somebody last night, how many people live in Cedar Falls? They said, oh, around 40,000. So we'd have 40,000 lawyers, and all they would do is walk down the street next to each other, say hello, and then hand each other a $200 bill. That'd be it. Community function comes from diversity and skill sets. We need doctors, we need teachers, we need nurses, we need, we need all, right? You can't just have, that's what makes a community function. Now, to really drive this point home, has anybody in here ever built a house or had a house built? You ever had a general contractor come up and tell you that he's an expert in all of it? Run. Run far away. You need those different skill sets because not all microbes can do the same thing. And they're so intimately tied together, this is what makes studying them so difficult. As soon as you try to isolate them from the soil community and you try to grow them in a lab to study them, they die. Because they need the other 7 microbes that were up the chain. So when you say one man's trash is another man's treasure, that's how metabolism works in the soil. One microbe does this, the next one does this, and the next one does this. And if this one's gone, this one dies. So that's why diversity is so important. And it's not just because you're trying to keep them alive, it's because of those functions that they produce for you. So we're going to take a step further and say, well, how do we look at function? This is just one way. So this is a couple of excerpt slides from the Genomics test from biomakers. We are currently running that test. There are other companies out there that do it, just full disclosure. But this is one of their reports, parts of it. And they are able to look at some of the same things, biomass, total bacteria, total fungi, you get a fungal to bacterial ratio, some of those things. But where this really hits home is when you start getting into how the biodiversity relates to function, soil function, and specifically jumping into the nutrient pathways. Now, I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but I see this a lot. We have 2 people farming, they share a fence. One guy says, my soil phosphorus level is 30 parts per million. The next guy says, mine is 30 parts per million. One guy has phosphorus deficiency in his corn, one doesn't. Has anybody experienced something like that? No, I'm the only one. I'm the only one. I get a lot of those phone calls. And what's the approach? When you've got phosphorus deficiency, what's the approach? Put more on, right? But the guy over here says, well, I don't have to put more on. No, you don't. So it's not just about what you got in the warehouse, it's how in the world is it being distributed. And when you start looking at these pathways and you understand that there's certain microbes that facilitate that process, you can start to identify gaps in the microbial community. Now, I don't know, I had a brilliant idea this morning. I thought maybe I should make a biological product because the market doesn't have nearly enough of those. And I'm not dogging on them. I get this question all the time. Well, does this work? I have never seen a biological product never work anywhere, and I've never seen one work everywhere. It's just my experience. But there are a lot of them out there, and they'll say, well, this jug has 12 different microbes in it, and it's got all of, there's 800 million of them in here, and this and this and this. Why would you be putting on microbes that are supposed to help you with phosphorus uptake if that's not your problem? If you already have those organisms in the community, why are you putting more of those on? The more on approach. So by identifying the gaps, you can start to tailor out and find products that maybe do respond well in your system. And the other thing I will mention about products is that just because you tried it and it didn't work, that doesn't mean you failed, it means you learned something. You can hook up jumper cables to a dead battery and see a pretty awesome response, right? But if you go hook up jumper cables and see no different response and the car starts anyway, well, you still learned something. That's a good thing. It means your car battery wasn't dead. You don't need jumper cables. So think of it that way. And when we start looking at these big four, the big macronutrients, you can see if you're going to gain, lose, if you're tying it up, is it being mineralized? What are the benefits for that potentially? And benefits can be a little bit defined by yourself. So if your goal is to build up carbon, and so you want, yeah, it needs to cycle, but you're trying to figure out how to build it up, and that's your goal. It also looks at a lot of these micronutrients, iron, zinc, manganese, sulfur, to help understand how this is being driven through. Now, this works well when somebody calls me and says, I don't understand. I evaluated my warehouse. I've got 800 pounds of phosphorus in the top 6 inches. I've got 70 pounds of phosphorus available. I'm still seeing phosphorus deficiency either staring at it at the plant, or my plant tissue results are saying it's low. This is when we need to start evaluating that distribution team, right? So, with that, I'm going to tell you what direction we're going. Seth, how much time do I got left?
How much do you want? 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm already over, aren't I?
Nope.
All right.
You're ahead of schedule.
Good. That never happens. So this is where we're going, okay? So when the Haney test first came out, this is how we made recommendations. So on the left-hand side is the conventional method of making nitrogen recommendations. On the right-hand side is how we were doing it with the Haney test. And again, they yell and scream and say, well, it's not calibrated, right? I go, calibrated? We're using the same process. As a matter of fact, we're using the same equations. The only difference is we're giving you credit for nitrogen that we never measured before. And if you are east of the Mississippi, they say credits from the soil test, they're 0. They give you none. I told this story the other day because I think it's funny. I had a guy in Florida call me up. He says, I'm sending you 15 soil samples to run the Haney test. Do me a favor, don't run nitrogen. I can't run the Haney test and not run nitrogen. There's 9 numbers for it. He says, oh, well, whatever, just run it. I said, okay. I said, now why didn't you want me to run nitrogen? Well, there's none there. Really, who told you that? University of Florida Extension. So what are they telling you to do? Put on 200 pounds for my corn. I said, did they ask you about your yield goals or potential? No, just straight 200 pounds. I says, okay. So we ran these 15 soil samples, and on average, across all 15 of them, he had over 400 pounds of residual nitrate in the top 6 inches. He goes, what? How? I said, because you've been putting more on. Well, what do I do? Plant corn. And then what? Watch it grow. Hope it rains. I don't know, but don't put more on. They don't even know because they're not even measuring it. Now, if nitrogen was free, I mean, we've got all the environmental things, but just pure economics as a farmer. If nitrogen was free, you might say, well, I don't care if I had 400, it's free, put it on, right? Last time I checked, none of the big fertilizer companies are doing this as a nonprofit donation, are they? I mean, I don't think they are. If they are, I wish they would have bailed me out and handed me $500,000 when I needed it, but they're not. So we took this approach. And if somebody says, I'm going to grow corn at 200 bushels, we use a factor of 1.1 pounds per bushel. Why 1.1? Well, because the university says that it's not calibrated. So we use their value. They use 1.1 at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So that's what we're using, 1.1. And you can go to different states. Iowa State's got a little different. I think they're about 1.2 maybe. I know it changes. I know Dr. Franzen in North Dakota released new ones a few years ago about if you've been no-till for 10 years, we'll use a different factor than we will if you're not. They've been arguing this and they're discussing it and trying to figure it out forever. But here's the problem. Does anybody know how much nitrogen is in a bushel of corn, the grain? 0.7 pounds, 0.68 actually. Where did the other 0.4 go? Where'd the other 0.5 go? Well, they got good answers for this. Well, you know, if it's wet and you've got light soil again, you leached it. If you got heavy soil and it's wet, you volatilized it. You know, if you put it on at the wrong time, we lost some of that, right? So we gotta, you know, there's all these reasons they give you. This is what I think it is. This is my opinion, so I can get yelled at for this, and I'm okay with that. If your job as a university is to guide agronomic decisions and you are building a reputation, do you want to be wrong? No. I don't want to be wrong either. So you build in a little bit of a gap, right? Pad the gap. So now you're an agronomist, you're 24 years old, you just graduated from Iowa State, and you want to go out and start your own consulting company, and you go out and buy a truck and you borrow some money from the bank and you create a brand and you start asking farmers to work with you. Do you want to be wrong? No. You don't want to be wrong. You're trying to build a reputation, try to build a business. What do? Pad the gap. Just a little. And now the farmer says, well, you know what? It's nice and easy for you to sit behind your chair at the university, behind your desk, and make recommendations. It's great for this kid to come over here and tell me what he thinks. This is my farm. Do I want to be wrong? No. Pad the gap. And then pretty soon we have a $30,000 car with a $1 million insurance policy. Who wins in that game? The insurance guy. Because if you wreck that $30,000 car, they're not going to hand you $1 million. They're going to tell you it was worth $12,000 and try to cut you a check. Right? If you're even lucky enough to get that far. My point is this, is that we followed this same thing. This is what we've been doing. The only difference that we have made is that we're giving you credits for things that you never got credit for before. It's a wonderful first step. Is there anybody in here who has their farm to an efficiency that they're pulling corn off at a nitrogen rate less than 1.1 applied? Most of you now. I applaud you. So does it do you any good if I'm still using 1.1 to tell you how much nitrogen, right? No, it doesn't. It's not helping you. Now, 10 years ago, I had this idea. The problem was that 10 years ago, there weren't enough people to where you were all at today to make changes to this. But this is what we're going to start doing. So this was a good start. We were able to tell this person that your total credit on the soil test was 122 pounds. Your recommendation went from 175 to 100. Now, I'm not telling you that you should just go out and cut it by 75 pounds. What I'm saying is use the data to try to guide those decisions. But we can do better. I put this slide at the end of every talk I've probably done for the last 10 years because I believed it 10 years ago and I saw it happening, but up until now, we didn't really know what to do with it. The soil health effect. Using conventional soils, and Seth, you can sit down. I got one more. Don't worry. All right. I said this was normally the end, but I got one after this. So using conventional soil tests and fertility requirements can lead to excess fertilizer being applied. Is anybody still sleeping? Does anybody know Russell Hedrick? Russell grew corn, a lot of it, a year ago. And no matter how big and strong Russell is, he couldn't fight off the terrible hurricane that took out North Carolina. But a couple years ago, he produced some pretty good corn. His soil phosphorus test level was less than 15 parts per million. I don't care what university you work for, what extension agency you work for, what lab you work for. Is 15 parts per million phosphorus enough to produce 450 bushel corn? No, not by conventional wisdom, right? Do most of you remember the late David Brandt? David did this for 20 years. His soil tests should have told him he should have been raising 30 bushel corn. He wasn't. Steve Groff, Pennsylvania. The names go on, and many of you in this room. So when somebody gives, like me, says you need 60, I would have told Russell, if he would have told me 450 bushel corn was his yield goal, I would have told him he needed 200 pounds of moron. And he didn't, right? Now, the University of NC State, of course, they told him, well, what you did is impossible. Okay. The conventional guys are saying it's impossible. The organic guys are saying it's impossible because he still put some things in. And I got other guys over here, the regenerative guys, screaming because he used a herbicide. Holy cow, who cares? 300 units in, pulls off 450 bushel corn, quick math, that's 0.7 pounds per bushel. That's a pretty good efficiency rate, right? I got guys putting 300 units on to pull 240 off in Nebraska all the time. So, with this soil health effect, I went out and hired this crazy guy. Rick Haney. You want to talk about an absolute perfect Forrest Gump Bubba relationship? It was fantastic. I'm sitting down with him one day at his house, maybe had a glass of bourbon, and he looked at me and he says, Lance, if you ever decide to start a lab, I'll be your first mate. Really? Well, put your money where your mouth is, Rick, because I went out and started one, and by God, he's called me up and he says, I'm ready to go, let's do it. We hired Rick, Chief Soil Obsessor. He's actually our Chief Scientific Officer, depending on who you ask, but I like Soil Obsessor better. And his job is to go through all of this data. He did not have access to soil test data outside of his test at the USDA. Now he's got data from PLFA, T&D, ag stability, conventional soil extracts, all on the same samples. We do that all the time, one sample, run them for all these tests, right? So for the last 3 years, he's been pouring through this, and he's come up with all of this. Now, and you're going to hear after I get done, when I stop running my mouth, you're going to get to hear from Sarah Martello at AgWise. And we brought them in, or they brought us in, or whatever. It was another one of those just crazy moments where we started talking, and they said, well, we want to develop a way to better manage individual farms. Why can't we? Rick's goal has always been, how do we calibrate a soil recommendation to your farm? Not to the state you live in or the region. We need your farm to be able to say, this is what your recommendation is based off your farm. So it's what we've been working towards for 4 years. So, building this into a software platform, it is an absolute monumental take. There are so many variables and factors to consider. But we are going to be using weather data. We are going to be using soil type data. You are going to be able to put in things from your management. You are going to be able to utilize the test data. It'll all be there. And we'll be able to look at graphs. How many people have asked me, I get this question every day, they say, Lance, what's a rank? I need a ranking on this. Is it good, bad, high, low? Now, the reason why we're asking that question is because in conventional agronomy, have you seen those tables that are out there and they say, from here to here is very low, from here to here is low, from here to here is medium, from here to, or high, or whatever they want to call it? Well, you look at one of those for phosphorus and it says from 15 to 25 is low, or adequate, excuse me. Here's the problem though, adequate for what? Because if a guy told me he was constantly raising 300 bushel corn, even with conventional agronomy wisdom, I would tell him he needs phosphorus. If a guy told me he's growing potatoes, I would say you need phosphorus. So when the guy in eastern Colorado looks at that table, he goes, I'm good. When the guy in Illinois looks at that table, he goes, I'm good. But in reality, you might both not be good. It has to do with what you're growing. So we're going to factor all of that in, and we're going to be able to tell you, yeah, we're going to provide what we call standard fertility recommendations. It's what we've been doing as a lab the whole time, using the Haney test. You can still get those. We're going to be able to rank these things. If anybody has looked at a Haney test report from us, there's a line under the results and it says rankings, and they've been blank since the dawn of time. Have you ever noticed that? And that's why people call me and say, well, what's the rank on this? Well, we have to go through and do it one-on-one. I have to ask a lot of questions and then I can tell you what those things are ranked. But that's what those are for, because that's going to start getting filled in. We're going to be able to rank out where you are. Is this number good, not based on a table, but is it good based on what you're trying to do? Respiration of 50 in Iowa on the soil health test is not fantastic. But if I was in New Mexico, I'd be pretty darn ecstatic, right? So we got to have context. Rick developed an organic nutrient density index off the Haney test. Everybody's talking about nutrient density. You can't have nutrient dense foods without organically nutrient dense soil. Then he developed an N&P water quality index, looking at the amount of inorganic phosphorus compared to organic phosphorus, inorganic nitrogen, all of those things that influence water quality going into your tile lines, into your watersheds. Then he says, okay, Rick and I sat down and we're going to make these soil health, we don't know what we're going to call it yet, soil health influenced fertility recommendations. Now, what I mean by that is that instead of using that standard factor of 1.1 pounds per bushel or using a standard factor on corn for phosphorus or potassium, we're going to factor in the health of your soil based on your results. And then we might use a factor of 1.1 if your soil's not very healthy, might even be up to 1.2. If your soil is really good and healthy, it might drop all the way down to 0.6. So we'll come back and say, you know what? This farm is pretty healthy. You're going to have a lot better nutrient use efficiency. We can get by with less applied. You still get credits from the soil test, but we're starting with a different, you changing the starting point. Instead of 220 required, maybe it's 180. And then we subtract everything out. That's going to be huge. I hear that more and more all the time. Farmers telling me, well, I followed your recommendation. Your rec was too high. That's because your soil's pretty darn healthy. And so now we got to do better. You're doing better, we got to do better. We got to get away from my own boron approach. If you run a TND test, we're going to start giving you national average comparison. And then we'll start to break that down regionally as we get more data. You'll get a percent of extractable. So this is what percentage of available versus non-available. And Rick has some really good data showing that as your soils get healthier, that greatly influences the amount of availability for potassium and calcium and things. What percent of those extractable nutrients compared to the national average? He's got a nitrogen pathway index, a phosphorus pathway index, a carbon efficiency index, and no, this has nothing to do with carbon markets. This has to do with how well your microbes are cycling carbon, and if we think you're going to build carbon or reduce it based on the demand of your soil. For the PLFA test, he's got AMF and SAP ratio. He's got some really good information around that. And then we're going to start doing an actual PLFA health score. So based on the PLFA test. And then finally, he's got this RTMB index. Now, Sarah's going to come up here in just a little bit. And I'm just going to, this is a quick 30-second snippet here, if it plays. But this is kind of what we're looking at, what it's going to kind of look like. It'll be a web-based system. Your data is going to be displayed in various ways. Now, by the way, I should say this. We're not forcing you to use this, by the way. So if you're sitting there going, well, I don't want you to do this, you don't have to. We're not going to force you. If you send a soil sample to us, we're not going to force you to use this. This is just something that's out there because I've got 3,500 clients asking, hello.
Dancing Pandas don't sell CRM.
Don't tell them. Stop, sorry. YouTube, baby, YouTube. I'm glad that was just YouTube. We could have had a really good video. That wasn't YouTube Kids. So the goal behind this, is I've got 3,500 clients and I've got people calling me every single week, usually multiple times a week, saying to me that we are seeing things on our farm that people can't explain. We know what's happening, but we're tired of taking the moron approach. And so we are developing these things to help you better manage your inputs. It's not about getting rid of them, it's about better managing them. Because last time I checked, they're not free, right? So with that, I'm gonna step off. I know Sarah's gonna talk some more about what they're doing at AgWise here in a minute. I'll be around. This is my contact information if you have any questions. And thank you. We're really excited about where this is going. So.